touched your skin. You saw a side of me no one else has seen. I had stopped believing, didn't want to feel, but now my walls are down, baby, here I am. Don't you change.
Neil Morelli, the Chief Industrial and Organizational Psychologist at Codility, is leading the next session titled, How You Can Help Hiring Managers Become Better Decision Makers. Certainly a plight we can all relate to. Without further ado, I'm handing it over to Neil.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming to my talk on the 3 ways TA pros can help hiring managers make better decisions. I'm Neil Morelli. I am Codility's Chief IO Psychologist. IO stands for Industrial Organizational, and it's really just the science of the workplace and work. And I've spent more than a decade helping different organizations try to be better at evidence-based hiring and selection. And I was hoping to share some of those lessons that I've learned and help our customers with, help you translate those things to hiring managers and their decision-making processes. So you probably know that hiring is important already, being in TA, but did you know that the average hiring mistake costs an organization 6 times an employee salary? We just inherently understand that hiring is important, and making a mistake here can be very costly. But what gets in the way of good hiring decisions? Well, oftentimes we're impacted by cognitive biases. Cognitive biases like single choice aversion and the paradox of choice. What do these mean? Single choice aversion is really just the dissatisfaction that you feel when you only have one or maybe no choices to choose from. So this little graphic here shows that when you maybe pair a choice with a couple of others, that choice then seems reasonable, whereas before on its own, it might not have. The paradox of choice is the dissatisfaction you might feel when you have too many choices. So this was a term coined by psychologist Barry Schwartz, and they used in their very famous study on the paradox of choice this manipulation of giving people the options of choosing different jams. And when they found that too many jams actually led to them feeling this dissatisfaction, they came to the conclusion that sometimes too many choices can sometimes paralyze you and keep you from making a decision, or help you fall back on making a sort of gut feelings-based decision, which might not ultimately be the best one. So how does this actually manifest in hiring? Well, I've got hopefully this lighthearted take on a well-meaning hiring manager who at first might say, hey, here's my list of qualifications for the job rec. And then you start to work with those. And then after a little while, when it's maybe hard to find candidates that meet all of those criteria, your hiring manager says, wait a second, there aren't enough candidates that meet all of these requirements. The ones that you've introduced don't check off all the boxes. So that means there aren't any good candidates. And I really think that this is how we might see single choice aversion showing up in the hiring process on the behalf of your hiring manager. And then it interacts with this other instance, this other cognitive bias of the paradox of choice, when we see a hiring manager who's now met several candidates say, okay, we've seen a lot of candidates. I guess I need to go with the one that feels right. And I need to keep seeing candidates until one feels right. And this is what I mean by this sort of over amount of information, too much information, too many choices to make. And so you tend to fall back, or all people tend to fall back on this sort of gut instinct, feelings-based choice, which might stand in contrast to the evidence that they're actually looking at. So how do we break free from these biases? We're all susceptible to them, and your hiring managers are no different. So how do we break free? Well, how you break free of the cognitive bias is that you set the right expectations. But in hiring, what does that mean? Well, it means that you have to set job relevant standards. Job relevant standards reduce choices to manageable levels and keep the perfect from being the enemy of good when making final choices. So it helps us not only kind of get to a better place where we have the right number of choices, it also helps us to process those choices appropriately. So how can we set good expectations based off of job relevant standards? I've got 3 strategies here, 3 ways to think about it. First of all, you can help hiring managers really understand the difference between minimum versus preferred skill qualifications, or really any qualifications for that matter. So I'm referencing a definition that is set by the OFCCP here in the United States. That is our regulatory body that regulates federal contractors for the federal government. So they have a very particular definition of what a minimum qualification is. Whether you're in the US or not, I think the truism here, the takeaway here is to really think through what are those minimally required qualifications. So these are oftentimes things that are interpreted by way of formal training or education. These are the experiential requirements. These are specific certifications or licenses. And so it's helpful to think, does this qualification mean that someone can perform at a minimally acceptable level? And if they can't, then it probably means that it needs to belong in this minimum qualification group. If it's a minimum qualification, this means that it's not something that could be trained within the first 6 months. And does it relate, the minimum qualification could relate to a legal professional or externally required prerequisite. So if you're concerned that setting minimum qualifications maybe lowers the bar, or you get that pushback from hiring managers, just remind them that anything that goes into that sort of gold standard, or anything that doesn't meet those definitions of a formal training, educational, work experience, certification, license, these kind of strict criteria, those should probably go in preferred qualifications. And this just helps set the number of choices that you end up having to make either at the screening phase or later on in the hiring process. So I wanted to give you one quick example of what that might look like. Here's an exemplary minimum qualification statement. This is for just a hypothetical communications tech 2 role. So you see here, it's got a combination of an educational requirement and an experiential requirement. And that sets that sort of minimally acceptable level of prerequisite knowledge and skill to do a job. And in that second example, we look at a educational requirement that you can look and just see on someone's resume, even whether or not they have that qualification, but it's also got an experiential standard that could replace or represent the same level of knowledge and skill that you might gain from an accredited technical trade school. So I thought these might be helpful examples to consider and just help your hiring managers think through what is really minimally required versus what's actually just preferred to set that job relevant standard. The next strategy here is to set clear job related evaluation criteria in the interview. So moving past the screening stage, getting into interviews, what I see oftentimes go wrong is that people don't stop to think, what is an acceptable or sort of a meets expectations response look and sound like for an interview? Whether or not you use behavioral based questions, whether or not you use a completely structured interview, what's really helpful to include is just this definition of what an acceptable response might include. So really ask your hiring managers to think through this. And if they do a little bit of thought and you've provoked that definition up front, it can help set those standards and expectations up front so that they're not then being paralyzed by not having too many choices or too few choices when they actually start to review candidates. And then the last one almost goes without saying, but the more standardized you can make your hiring process, the better, because in the standardized hiring process, you're really choosing which competencies and skills, qualifications need to be assessed or measured, and then who or how are those competencies being assessed. So this little graphic here just shows that you might have a combination of things that you're looking at. That might be technical knowledge. I have a few examples for, say, a software developer, engineer. And that might be assessed by some sort of assessment, a skills assessment, kind of like Codility. You might also be looking for contextual behaviors like communication, adaptation, continual learning, and those might be assessed through some sort of virtual interview. And then you might have some kind of values fit assessment where you're looking at whether or not someone is really congruent with and holds to and shares the values of your organization, which means that they would be a good addition to your culture. And that might be more of that kind of face-to-face person or maybe even a panel interview that's really understanding what a candidate's values are. So just thinking through both the competencies, how those competencies will be assessed, and in the case where it's a very interview-centric process, thinking through who will assess each one of these, that gets us to a place where, again, we're setting the right expectations. You're not getting vague information that is then unhelpful when you're having to review and really boil down and whittle down the number of choices that have to be made later on in the process, and you're not being susceptible to this paradox of choice and having that kind of dissatisfaction with the candidates that you do see because it's hard to compare them and tell them apart at that point. That standardized process just gives you that playbook and that roadmap to make those decisions really well later on. So in summary, we want to get rid of or replace the vague or hasty hiring standards because those will cause poor decisions from having too many or too few choices in the hiring process. And we want to replace that with setting job relevant standards that lead to really great decisions because you've balanced the number of candidates in your pipeline and you've set those expectations that help you break free of the cognitive biases that we're all susceptible to. So just in closing, let me leave you with one thought exercise, one takeaway. What's one incremental thing you could do to make hiring standards more job relevant in your hiring process? So here are a few examples. You don't have to do all of these, but just pick one. What's one thing you might want to talk to somebody about or try? And that first one could be maybe identifying the job's critical and required competencies and skills, which translate into how you set up those preferred and minimum qualifications on a job description. It might mean taking the qualifications that you already have on your job description and separating them into easily observable, easily identifiable minimum qualifications that are either experience or education and certification based versus all of the other things that tend to get thrown into one big bucket, which again helps us make better choices earlier on in the process, which then reduce down in a healthy way the number of choices we have to make later on. You could just ask job experts to define what that acceptable response looks like on an interview and just use those behavioral standards. What are some examples? What are some types of answers that you might listen for and hear in an interview that would really designate that this person is meeting expectations for whatever that interview is designed to measure? And then lastly, to kind of summarize it, it's creating a playbook. Maybe consider you've got a structured interview, you've got your qualifications on your job description set up, but do you have a playbook? Do you have a plan for who or how you'll assess each of those competencies at each point in the process and just have those defined early on and beforehand before you actually start to see candidates, because then you won't be overcome or overwhelmed by the number of choices that have to be made later on. So I hope that's helpful. Thanks so much for listening. Here's a little bit more about Codility, and please reach out to me with any questions. Thanks.